The galaxy had long whispered the name of Queen Exira, and those whispers were enough to make even the bravest soldiers pause. She was a towering figure, with her sleek, dark exoskeleton gleaming under the light of distant stars. Her alien form was both terrifying and awe-inspiring, her four long, sharp arms capable of tearing through the strongest of metals, her eyes glowing with the cold intensity of someone who had ruled the Varelian dominion for centuries. To the Varelians, she was an untouchable deity, feared and respected beyond imagination. No one dared challenge her or her empire. She had crushed revolts, silenced threats, and maintained her dominance over entire star systems with unmatched precision. The galaxy trembled under her power, and yet she ruled with the calm assurance of one who had nothing to prove. But as humanity began to spread across the stars, their presence caught her attention. The Terrans were bold, unyielding, and above all, different. They were not like the countless species who bowed to her might. They resisted, questioned, and challenged her without fear. To Exira, this was an annoyance, but also something curious. How could these fragile, short-lived beings possess such audacity? Among the humans was Captain Dorian Vex, a soldier whose reputation had already spread throughout the galaxy. He was young, brash, and reckless, with a streak of genius that often saved his life and the lives of those around him. Standing at just over 6 feet tall, with short, dark hair and sharp green eyes that seemed to never rest, Dorian was the kind of person who could make an enemy out of anyone and somehow always talk his way out of it. His personality was a volatile mix of charisma and impatience, and when he set his mind to something, there was no turning back. Dorian was no stranger to danger. In fact, he thrived in it. But even he had heard the stories about Exira and the Varelian Dominion. The stories were enough to make even the most seasoned of soldiers hesitate, but not Dorian. In fact, he found himself itching for a challenge. He had heard rumors of an upcoming peace summit between humanity and the Varelians, and though it was supposed to be a moment for diplomacy, Dorian knew something would go wrong. He was certain of it. When the summit finally took place on the neutral moon of Veldros 9, Dorian was there. He wore his standard military uniform, a sleek black suit adorned with the insignia of the Terran Federation. He stood in the background, observing, his sharp gaze darting from one figure to the next. There, on the high platform, was Queen Exira herself. She was everything the stories had promised: graceful, terrifying, and completely unreadable. Her many eyes scanned the room, her many limbs poised with perfect elegance. There was no emotion in her gaze, only the quiet power of someone who knew that she could end all of this in an instant if she so chose. Yet, despite her overwhelming presence, Dorian couldn't help but feel a spark of defiance within himself. She might rule with fear, but humanity didn't bow easily, and that, he thought, was a problem he could fix. Little did he know that his impulsive nature would lead to a fateful encounter with the untouchable queen, one that would change the galaxy forever. The peace summit on Veldros 9 had barely begun when things took a dangerous turn. Dorian Vex, ever the skeptic, watched with a keen eye as the delegates, both human and Varelian, exchanged words. The atmosphere in the Grand Chamber was tense, every word spoken with careful precision. On one side, Queen Exira stood like an immovable statue, surrounded by her loyal Varelian generals. Her presence alone was enough to make even the most seasoned diplomats nervous. On the other side, the humans, led by Ambassador Asha Calloway, tried to maintain their composure. Despite the attempt at diplomacy, Dorian couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. There were too many Varelian eyes flicking nervously between each other, too many whispered conversations. He had been in enough dangerous situations to know when something wasn't right. The moment came without warning. An explosion rocked the chamber, sending pieces of stone and metal flying through the air. The room descended into chaos as alarms blared, and soldiers scrambled to protect their leaders. Dorian instinctively dropped to the floor, his military training kicking in. The air was thick with smoke and dust, but his eyes remained focused on the center of the room. In the aftermath of the blast, it became clear that a coup was underway. A rogue faction within the Varelian military, having long plotted against Queen Xyra's rule, had seized the opportunity to strike. They moved with deadly precision, targeting the Queen's guards, taking down the Varelian elite one by one. For a brief moment, the air was filled with the sound of screams, weapons clashing, and the heavy thudding of boots on the stone floor. But amidst the chaos, something unexpected happened. Dorian's sharp eyes caught sight of Queen Xyra, standing alone, seemingly unaffected by the carnage unfolding around her. She wasn't fleeing, wasn't cowering. She was preparing to face the attackers head-on. That was when it happened. In a split second of madness, Dorian made his decision. He bolted toward her, his heart pounding in his chest. The others might have thought him crazy, daring to get so close to the most powerful being in the galaxy. But in that moment, he didn't care. He wasn't sure what drove him to act, but something inside him told him that if anyone could survive this, it was her. And if anyone could protect her, it was him. As Dorian reached the Queen, a Varelian soldier lunged at her, his sharp blade aimed straight for her chest. Without thinking, Dorian tackled the soldier to the ground, wrestling the blade out of his hand and knocking him unconscious with a swift punch. The remaining attackers hesitated, unsure of what to make of the human's sudden intervention. Dorian's breath came in heavy gasps, but he didn't stop. He grabbed Sarah's arm, yanking her away from the danger. In that instant, he was sure she would strike him down. How could he dare touch the Queen? But instead of tearing his arm off, Xyra froze. Her many eyes narrowed as she looked at him, her mind working to process what had just happened. No one, no matter how powerful, had ever dared touch her without permission. It was an insult, a violation of every Varelian code. And yet here he was, a human, one who had just saved her life. You dare? Xyra's voice was low and full of suspicion, yet there was a strange, almost intrigued, edge to it. Dorian looked back at her, his face a mix of defiance and determination. "Seems I do," he said with a grin that could have been seen as either foolish or brave, perhaps both. "Now, how about we get out of here alive?" For a brief moment, there was only silence as Xyra studied him, her gaze piercing and unyielding. And then, with a subtle nod, she allowed him to pull her further away from the ongoing battle. Dorian Vex had done the impossible. He had saved the Queen of the Varelian Dominion, and in doing so, had set a dangerous, unpredictable path in motion. The question now was, what would come of it? The chaos of the battle continued to rage around them, but for a brief moment, time seemed to slow. Dorian Vex pulled Queen Xyra further into the shadows of the ruined conference hall, his hand gripping her arm tightly. Her presence was like a force of nature, cold, unyielding, and dangerously close. He could feel the strength in her limbs, the power in every movement she made. Despite the overwhelming danger, there was an undeniable tension in the air between them. Dorian had done something no one else had ever dared to do. He had touched the Queen, and not just touched her, but grabbed her and pulled her away from certain death. The entire Varelian Empire was built on the idea that no one, not even the highest-ranking officials, could lay a hand on Xyra without facing dire consequences. The fact that a human had done so, and, in doing so, saved her life was enough to make even the most loyal of her soldiers hesitate. Xyra's many eyes, sharp, glowing, and full of unspoken fury, were locked on Dorian. Her jaw tightened, her body stiffened, and yet she didn't pull away. Instead, she stood still, staring at him, trying to understand the audacity of this human. She had known power her entire life, wielded it with absolute authority, and crushed anyone who thought they could challenge her. But this human, this strange, unpredictable creature, was different. He had defied the very thing that had kept her safe for centuries, the unbreakable barrier of respect and fear that surrounded her. And now he was standing so close that she could feel his breath on her skin, smell the faint scent of sweat and gunpowder on him. He was so human, and for some reason that fact bothered her more than she cared to admit. Dorian, for his part, was unaware of the internal battle raging inside Xyra's mind. His focus was on the immediate danger, the Varelian traitors still flooding the room, hunting for the queen. They had to move, and they had to move fast. He didn't care about the politics, the unspoken rules of alien societies, or what her kind would do to a mere human who dared touch one of their own. All he cared about was getting them out alive. He knew the odds were slim, but he was used to impossible situations. He wasn't going to let fear or history hold him back, and despite the quiet tension between them, he couldn't help but feel a strange sense of satisfaction that he was the one to pull her away from the flames of death. He didn't expect thanks. Hell, he didn't even expect her to speak to him, but there was something incredibly satisfying about the fact that he had done the impossible. For a long moment, the only sound was the distant gunfire and the occasional scream as the battle raged on. Then, Xyra finally broke the silence. Her voice was low, almost a growl, and it sent a shiver down Dorian's spine. "You dare touch me," she said, her words laced with something that could have been anger, or something else entirely. "No one has ever dared do so and lived to speak of it." Dorian met her gaze without flinching. "I guess I'm not most people," he replied, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. Xyra studied him, her many eyes flicking over his face, his body. She was trying to find something: weakness, fear, hesitation. But she found none. Instead, there was only resolve, determination, and something else. Curiosity. It was strange to her, this feeling that stirred inside her, something she hadn't felt in centuries. The urge to understand this human. Why had he acted so boldly? Why had he defied her without fear? What made him different from every other creature that had either bowed to her or feared her? "You are a fool," she finally said, but there was no venom in her words. There was something else, but perhaps a necessary one. Dorian chuckled, pulling her into motion as he led her through the chaos. "I prefer bold," he said with a grin. Despite the situation, despite the danger, despite the Queen of the Varelian Dominion walking beside him, Dorian couldn't help but feel a strange sense of triumph. He had touched the untouchable queen, and in doing so, had created an undeniable connection between them. The consequences of that would come soon enough. But for now, the only thing that mattered was getting out alive. The hallways of the Veldros 9 summit were a maze of twisting corridors, their cold stone walls echoing with the sounds of distant combat. Smoke filled the air, and the unmistakable scent of gunpowder lingered. Yet, in the midst of the chaos, Dorian Vex and Queen Xyra moved with purpose, their footsteps steady despite the chaos unfolding around them. The room where the explosion had detonated was now a war zone, and Dorian knew that if they didn't leave the facility soon, they would be trapped. His instincts as a soldier told him that staying put would only get them both killed. But as they moved, Dorian couldn't help but steal glances at Xyra, walking beside him. She was a giant among her people, with her many arms and her sleek exoskeleton, a being who could tear through an army with a single swipe. But right now, she was a queen on the run. For the first time in centuries, someone had dared to lay a hand on her. And it had been a human. Dorian. That fact unsettled her more than she was willing to admit, but it also intrigued her. The further they traveled through the hallways, the more Dorian began to realize how much danger they were in. Varelian soldiers, once loyal to their queen, had begun to switch sides, their loyalty no longer guaranteed after the coup. The rebel forces were closing in on all sides, and the clock was ticking. Despite the chaos, Xyra's calm remained unshaken. There was a certain stillness to her, as though her mind had already moved beyond the current battle, planning the next phase. For Dorian, this was a whole new world, a world where power didn't come from strength alone, but from something more intangible, something deeper, and it was clear that Syra, as powerful as she was not used to this kind of uncertainty. She had always been in control, always the one to dictate the terms. Yet now she found herself relying on a human soldier who, by all rights, should have been beneath her. Dorian, on the other hand, was starting to realize just how much he didn't know about the Vrelian queen. He had seen her as a symbol of untouchable power, a force of nature that couldn't be understood. But now, as they moved together through the facility, he was starting to see the cracks in the image. Queen Syra was not the infallible goddess her people believed her to be. She was a leader, yes, but one who had been betrayed by those closest to her, left to fight a war she never saw coming. She wasn't used to being vulnerable. And yet here she was, trusting the human she had only just met. Dorian, for his part, was used to being underestimated. He had spent his entire life being told he was too young, too reckless, too human to accomplish anything significant. But now, in this strange moment of camaraderie with the Vrelian queen, he was beginning to understand that the one thing that separated him from others was his willingness to act, to take risks when others hesitated. It didn't take long for them to find a small room where they could regroup. Dorian quickly set up a makeshift barricade, using what little cover they could find. Syra, despite her fearsome appearance, seemed almost out of place here. She was a being of immense power, used to commanding armies, but right now she was without her usual support, without her forces at her back. And for the first time, Dorian saw her as something more than just a queen. She was a leader without a kingdom, a soldier without an army. For the first time, they were both equals, trapped in a situation that neither could control. There was no immediate enemy in front of them, but the tension in the air was palpable. They both knew the battle wasn't over, and the storm was far from passing. "You should have let me go," Syra said quietly, her eyes scanning the room, her voice almost softer than Dorian had expected. "You risk your life for a queen who is not yours to protect." Dorian met her gaze, his eyes unwavering. "Maybe I don't need a reason," he said with a grin. "Maybe I just like a challenge." Syra studied him for a moment, her many eyes narrowing. She could feel the defiance in his words, the challenge he had thrown at her. It was the same defiance she had seen in her own people's rebels, but something about it was different. This human was not trying to take her power. He wasn't looking to destroy her. He was simply looking to survive, just like her. "Perhaps," Syra said slowly, her voice filled with an unreadable emotion, "we both have more to learn from each other than we first thought." And for the first time, Dorian felt the shift in their relationship. What had started as a gamble, a reckless act of defiance, was now turning into something more. A partnership, born in the heat of battle, forged in the most unlikely of circumstances. Dorian and Queen Syra had barely caught their breath when the door to their makeshift safe room slammed open. A group of Vrelian rebels had found them, their faces twisted with anger and desperation. These were not the typical soldiers who had once served Syra with unwavering loyalty. No, these were the ones who had turned against her, the ones who sought to replace her with their own ideals. Their eyes were wild, their weapons drawn, and it was clear that they saw the queen as a symbol of everything that was wrong with their empire. They had come to finish what they had started, to eliminate the woman who had ruled them for centuries. To them, she was not a queen to be protected, but a tyrant to be overthrown. Dorian moved instinctively, his hand already reaching for the blaster at his side. He had fought in many battles before, but this was different. These weren't faceless enemies. These were rebels who had once sworn allegiance to the very woman he stood beside. He could see the fury in their eyes, the betrayal that ran deep. They were not just fighting for power, they were fighting for freedom from the rule of the Vrelian queen. And in their minds, that freedom could only come with her death. But Dorian had a different idea. He had already saved Syra once, and he wasn't about to let these rebels take her down now. Syra, however, was not so quick to move. She stood still, her eyes calculating as she observed the rebels. She could sense the tension in the room, feel the anger that was building. The rebels were not just here for her. They were here to destroy everything she had built. She had been a queen for centuries, and yet in this moment she could feel the weight of her rule shifting. The betrayal was like a dagger to her heart, and the one thing she had never truly understood, the fragility of power, was now staring her in the face. She had ruled through fear, through strength, and through her unyielding will. But in that moment, she realized that all of that could be undone in an instant. The leader of the rebels, a tall Varelian named Korek, stepped forward, his blade gleaming in the dim light. He was a striking figure, his dark exoskeleton adorned with the insignia of the rebel faction. His eyes locked onto Xyra, filled with venom. "You should have died long ago, Queen," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You've had your reign. Now it's time for a new era to begin." Dorian stood his ground, positioning himself between Xyra and the rebels. His body was tense, ready to spring into action at any moment. He knew this wasn't going to be a simple fight. These rebels were determined, and they had the advantage of numbers. But Dorian wasn't about to back down. He had come this far, and he would not allow them to take the queen without a fight. "Enough, Korek." Xyra's voice cut through the tension. She stepped forward, her presence undeniable. The rebels hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to respond. "You've made your point," she continued, her voice cold and commanding. "But know this, I will not go down without a fight. You can take my empire, but you will never take my life." Korek's eyes narrowed, his grip on his weapon tightening. "You're a fool, Queen. You think you still have control. Look at what you've created." Xyra's expression remained unchanged. "It's true that the empire is crumbling," she said, her voice calm but filled with an unshakable authority. "But that doesn't mean I'm weak. I am the Varelian Queen, and I will fight until my last breath to protect what's mine." With those words, the tension in the room reached its breaking point. Korek lunged forward, his blade aimed at Xyra, but Dorian was quicker. In a flash, he raised his blaster and fired, hitting Korek in the shoulder and sending him crashing to the ground. The room erupted into chaos as the rebels charged forward, but Dorian and Xyra moved as one. She fought with the precision of a seasoned warrior, her multiple arms moving in perfect harmony, striking down enemies with deadly accuracy. Dorian, though less experienced, was no slouch. He fired his blaster with deadly precision, taking down rebels one by one. In the midst of the battle, something shifted. As Xyra and Dorian fought side by side, something began to form between them, a bond, a respect that had not been there before. They were both warriors, both survivors, and in that moment, they realized that despite their differences, they were stronger together. The rebels, though fierce, were no match for the combined force of the queen and the human soldier. And as the last of the rebels fell, the room fell silent once more. Xyra turned to Dorian, her eyes locking onto his with an intensity he had never seen before. "You have earned my respect, human," she said quietly. "But know this, you are now part of something much bigger than yourself." Dorian met her gaze, a smirk tugging at his lips. "I've never been afraid of a challenge." The battle had barely subsided when Dorian and Xyra found themselves standing in the aftermath of the fight. The room was strewn with the fallen bodies of the rebels, their weapons discarded in the heat of their final confrontation. The air was thick with the smell of blood and smoke, but despite the carnage, both Dorian and Xyra stood tall, unyielding. For a moment, the two of them were silent, their eyes meeting in a moment of shared understanding. They had both fought for survival, but there was more than just survival at stake now. In the heat of battle, something had changed between them. They were no longer just an unwilling alliance of convenience. They had become something else. Partners, if only for a moment, bound by a shared experience that had tested them both. Dorian wiped the sweat from his brow, his eyes scanning the room. The rebels had been defeated, but the fight was far from over. They still had a long way to go before they were out of danger. The Varelian Empire had fractured, and now, as the dust settled, they had to figure out what came next. Dorian knew this much. They couldn't just run. If they left Veldros 9 now, it wouldn't be long before the rebels regrouped and hunted them down. Thyra was no fool. She knew the empire she had once ruled was slipping through her fingers. And for the first time, she was forced to face the reality of her situation. Her power was fading, and there was no one left to help her rebuild. "You're not safe here," Dorian said, his voice low but firm. He turned to Xyra, his face serious. "The rebels are still out there, and they'll be looking for you. If we stay, we'll be sitting ducks." Sarah nodded slowly, her many eyes narrowing in thought. She had known this would happen, knew that there were always forces ready to challenge her rule, but she had never thought it would come to this. She had always been in control, always held the power. And yet now she found herself with nothing but the ruins of her empire and the uncertain alliance of a human soldier. "I know," Kyra replied, her voice soft, but edged with frustration. "But where can we go? The rebels control the system now. I've lost the loyalty of my people. They no longer see me as their queen. They see me as a symbol of oppression." Dorian took a step forward, his eyes meeting hers with unwavering confidence. "Then we make a new plan. You're not finished yet. You've still got a lot of fight left in you. And I'm not walking away until we figured this out." Zyra's gaze softened, and for the briefest moment, Dorian saw something in her eyes he hadn't expected: vulnerability. She was a ruler, yes, but she was also a person, someone who had spent her entire life at the top, only to find herself alone and vulnerable. It was a look that haunted him more than he cared to admit. "You're right," Xyra said quietly, her voice steadier now. "I've been holding on to the past, afraid to face what's coming. But you're offering me something I didn't think I needed: hope. And that's more than I've had in a long time." Dorian's lips curled into a small, knowing smile. "Sometimes all you need is a little push." Zara studied him for a long moment, her eyes flicking over his face. She could feel the shift in their dynamic, the unspoken understanding between them. In this moment, he was no longer just a human soldier. He was something more. He was an ally, someone who saw the potential in her even when the rest of the galaxy had written her off. And for the first time, she wondered what it would be like to let go of the past, to embrace a future that wasn't defined by the throne she had once held. "So, what's the plan?" Tyra asked, her voice steady once more. She was ready to move forward, ready to fight for something new. Dorian grinned, his fingers brushing over the controls of his comm device. "First, we need to get off Veldros 9. Then, we start building alliances. We may not have the Empire anymore, but we've still got power. And we can use that to rally the right people." Zyra's eyes gleamed with determination. "I've always been a queen, Dorian. But perhaps it's time to be something else. A leader, not of an empire, but of a revolution." Dorian nodded, his expression one of approval. "Exactly. We're not just fighting for survival anymore. We're fighting for something bigger." Together, they turned toward the door, ready to face whatever came next. They were no longer just a soldier and a queen. They were partners, bound by circumstance, united by a common goal. And whatever happened, they would face it together. The journey out of Veldros 9 was far from easy. Dorian and Sarah had to move quickly, carefully avoiding the rebel patrols that searched for them relentlessly. The once vibrant city had become a war zone, its towering buildings reduced to rubble, streets now crisscrossed with barricades and scattered bodies. The rebels had taken control of most of the planet, and the remnants of the Varelian loyalists were in disarray. But even in the heart of chaos, Cyra's resolve remained firm. She had faced betrayal before, but never had she been forced to flee from her own people. The weight of her failure hung heavy on her shoulders, but there was still a flicker of determination in her heart. She refused to let everything she had built crumble without a fight. Dorian, on the other hand, couldn't help but feel a sense of urgency. He had fought in many battles before, But this was different. This wasn't just a mission, this was survival. The stakes were higher than ever, and every step they took seemed to lead them further into the unknown. He had never imagined himself in a position like this, fighting alongside an alien queen against a rebellion that wanted her dead. But as they navigated through the darkened streets, moving from one hidden location to another, Dorian couldn't shake the feeling that they were part of something much larger now. Zyra wasn't just a queen. She was a symbol, and he was by her side because he believed in her, whether he fully understood it or not. After days of running, they finally reached the outskirts of the city, where a small secret base lay hidden beneath the surface. The base was old, forgotten by most, but it still held value. This was where their new plan would begin. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Dorian and Sarah set up camp in the dark, damp halls of the underground facility, the only light coming from the flickering consoles that lined the walls. Here, in the silence, they were able to regroup, plan, and take stock of their situation. "Do you really think we can pull this off?" Dorian asked, his voice filled with uncertainty as he looked at Zyra. He was tired, physically and mentally, from the constant pressure of being on the run. But the sight of her standing tall, her posture unbroken by the days of hardship, gave him a sense of reassurance. She had been through worse, he reminded himself. This was just another battle. Zyra glanced over at him, her expression unreadable. For a moment, she said nothing. Her gaze focused on the holographic map of the system they were now planning to infiltrate. She was thinking, strategizing, plotting. Her mind was always working, always calculating the next move, the next step in the revolution she was trying to rebuild. "Of course we can," Zyra replied finally, her voice calm but filled with conviction. "We've lost battles before, Dorian, but we're still standing, and we will keep standing until we win." Her words were simple, yet there was an undeniable strength in them. Dorian could hear the weight of her experience behind those words, the countless struggles she had faced in her long reign as queen. She had been born into power, but it was clear now that she had learned the price of it. The cost of being a leader, the sacrifice required to hold on to control. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for a future, a new order that wasn't bound by the mistakes of the past. "We'll need allies," Dorian said, sitting down beside her. "And I'm not talking about the people who followed you before. We need fresh support, new faces, new blood." Zyra nodded slowly. "I know, and that's where you come in, Dorian." He raised an eyebrow. "Me? How?" "You've seen how the rebels fight," Zyra explained. "You know their tactics, their weaknesses. And you know people. You know how to rally them, to convince them to join us. I've never been good at making alliances. I've always ruled through force. But we can't win this with force alone." Dorian thought about it for a moment. It was true. He had always been a soldier, never a diplomat. But if Zyra was willing to trust him with something as important as this, then maybe it was time to try something new. Maybe it was time to stop thinking of himself as just a soldier and start seeing himself as part of something bigger, something that could change the fate of the galaxy. "I'll do what I can," Dorian said, a new sense of determination in his voice. "We'll find those allies. We'll make them see what we're fighting for." Zyra smiled, a rare moment of warmth crossing her face. "I know we will." And as they sat in the dimly lit room, their plans beginning to take shape, the sound of distant gunfire echoed through the walls. The storm was still gathering, and there was no turning back now. But together, they were ready to face whatever came next. The days that followed were a blur of planning, action, and careful maneuvering. Dorian and Sarah spent their time in the hidden underground base, working tirelessly to gather intelligence and build the necessary support to strike back at the rebels. The world outside was growing more dangerous with each passing hour. The once thriving city of Veldros 9 had become a battlefield, and the streets were no longer filled with the voices of the people, but with the shouts of rebels and soldiers, each vying for control of what was left of the empire. But Xyra's determination burned brighter than the chaos that surrounded them. She had made her decision. She would rebuild, and she would lead. Dorian, too, was finding a new purpose in this war. He had come to Veldrosnine as a mercenary, hired to do a job and collect a paycheck. But as the days wore on, his feelings shifted. This wasn't just a job anymore. The stakes had grown higher, and he had become emotionally invested in their fight. He had seen the fire in Xyra's eyes, the resolve that refused to fade despite the overwhelming odds stacked against them. He could not walk away now. Not when he had witnessed her strength, not when he had seen the person she truly was beyond the queen who ruled an empire. She was a fighter, and she had earned his respect. It was on the fourth day, as they began to form alliances with various factions on the planet, that they met their first true challenge. A messenger arrived, breathless and covered in dust from the long journey across the planet's surface. She came from the Free Coalition, a group of rebels who had once fought alongside Xyra, but had since broken away. They were hesitant to align themselves with the former queen, unsure of her true intentions. The coalition, like many others, had lost faith in Xyra's leadership, and they were not easily swayed by promises of power. Dorian and Xyra stood in front of the messenger, their faces tense as they listened to her words. The situation was fragile. One wrong move, one wrong word, and they could lose everything. "The coalition will not fight for you, Queen," the messenger said, her voice sharp. "You betrayed us once before. You were a ruler who only cared about maintaining your power. We have no reason to trust you now." Xyra's expression didn't waver. She had expected this, but it still hurt. She had spent years keeping her people in line, doing whatever it took to secure her position. And now, it seemed, the very people she had ruled over had turned their backs on her. But she wasn't about to let them dictate her future. Not again. "I know I have failed you," Xyra said quietly, her voice filled with an unexpected honesty. "But I'd learned from my mistakes. I am not asking for your loyalty because of what I was. I am asking for it because of what we can become together. The empire is crumbling, and we are fighting for something bigger than just a throne. We are fighting for the future of Veldrosnine, for the people who deserve better than the endless cycles of war and oppression. I cannot do this alone, but together we can rise from the ashes." The messenger stared at her, her eyes searching Xyra's face for any hint of deceit. There was none. And after what seemed like an eternity, she nodded slowly, her expression softening. "Perhaps you have changed," the messenger said, her voice still uncertain, but with a glimmer of hope. "But you must prove it to us. Actions speak louder than words." With that, the messenger turned to leave, but before she could take more than a few steps, Dorian spoke up. "You'll see," he said with a steady voice, his eyes meeting hers. "We'll prove it. Together." And as the messenger departed, Dorian and Xyra shared a look, one that spoke volumes. They had made their first step toward redemption. It was a small victory, but it was enough to give them the hope they needed to press on. They couldn't afford to waste time. The rebellion had already taken root, and they had to act before it became too powerful. The days ahead would not be easy. They would face more challenges, more betrayals, and more battles. But for the first time in a long time, Xyra believed that victory was within their grasp. With Dorian by her side, the people they had gathered behind them, and the resolve to see this fight through to the end, they were no longer just fighting to survive. They were fighting to build something new, something better. The final push had begun. Dorian and Xyra stood on the edge of the battlefield, their eyes fixed on the horizon, where the storm clouds of war loomed. The revolution they had set in motion was now a living, breathing force, and there was no turning back. Over the past few weeks, they had gathered their allies. The Free Coalition, loyalists who had once followed Xyra, and those who had joined the cause because they believed in the change they were fighting for. Together, they had spent countless hours training, strategizing, and preparing for the inevitable confrontation with the rebel forces that had taken over Veldros 9. Every day had been a test of endurance, of trust, and of willpower. But now, the time had come to make their stand. The rebel stronghold stood tall in the distance, a fortress of steel and stone, its walls impenetrable and its defenses formidable. But Dorian wasn't worried. They had learned everything they needed to know about their enemy's weaknesses. They had spent days infiltrating the rebel network, gaining valuable intelligence that would give them the edge. They had studied every shift in the rebels' patrols, every gap in their defenses. Clara had led them with the precision of a commander, guiding them through the dark, tactical moves that would allow them to strike where it hurt the most. As the sun set, casting an orange glow over the landscape, Thyra turned to Dorian. Her eyes were calm, but there was a fire burning inside her. This was it, the moment that would define everything they had fought for, the moment that would either see the rebirth of her reign or the end of it forever. "This is it, Dorian," Exira said, her voice steady. "We either win tonight, or we lose everything." Dorian nodded, his jaw set in determination. "We'll win," he said simply, though the weight of the situation was clear in his voice. The odds were against them, but he believed in Exira, and he believed in their cause. The rebels had underestimated them, thinking that a broken queen and a lone human soldier wouldn't be enough to change the course of the war. But they had underestimated the strength of those who had rallied behind them, the people who had grown tired of endless fighting and the suffering caused by the rebellion's greed for power. With a final glance at the horizon, Thyra turned and signaled for the attack to begin. The troops they had gathered moved swiftly, spreading out across the battlefield. The night was their ally, and they used it to their advantage. Dorian led a small group through the rebel lines, using his tactical knowledge to disable their communications and take out key targets. Thyra led another group, her command skills shining through as she coordinated the assault from behind the front lines. The first wave of their attack was brutal. The rebels had been caught off guard, their defenses weakened by the careful strikes Dorian and Sarah had planned. But they quickly regrouped, rallying their forces to fight back with all the fury they could muster. The air was filled with the sounds of explosions, gunfire, and the clash of metal. But even in the chaos, Thyra remained focused, her eyes never leaving the battlefield as she commanded her troops with unwavering confidence. Dorian fought with a fierceness that surprised even him. He was no longer just a soldier in the midst of a conflict. He was fighting for something far greater. He was fighting for the future of Veldros 9, for the people who had once been forgotten. He had seen what Thyra was capable of, and he had seen the good she could do when given the chance could finally have a voice. And that was worth fighting for. Hours passed. The battle raged on, and the tides began to turn in their favor. Slowly but surely, the rebels were pushed back. The fortress that had once seemed impenetrable was now vulnerable, its walls crumbling under the weight of the revolution. And then, in the heart of the chaos, Thyra and Dorian faced the rebel leader, a man who had once been a trusted ally, but had turned on her, betraying her and taking her empire for himself. The final showdown was inevitable. Thyra stepped forward, her eyes locking with the rebel leaders, a quiet determination in her gaze. "This ends now," she said, her voice cold but resolute. With one final clash, the battle was won. The rebel leader fell, his forces scattered. The war that had torn Veldros 9 apart for so long was finally over. Thyra stood amidst the wreckage, her heart heavy, but her resolve unwavering. She had won, but the true work was just beginning. It wasn't about reclaiming her throne. It was about rebuilding a broken world. Dorian stood by her side, and together, they looked out over the battlefield. The sun was rising, casting light over the horizon. A new dawn had begun. The future of Veldros 9 was uncertain, but one thing was clear: they would face it together, ready to build something better from the ashes of the old.